Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. The episode that we're going to be pulling here today is actually not something that comes from a poll. I know that the way that things normally operate on here is that we take the top liked most comments from the previous videos, we put that into a poll, and then you all vote on it. Which, yes, we're going to get back doing, but I am going away for a while, and so as a result, I have to get as many things made as I possibly can, and you all gave some really interesting scenarios. One of which, what if the communists had actually taken over Germany instead of the fascists, which is truly fascinating, and I was hoping going into this that, like, hey, maybe I can go and find a mod that presents exactly this, but everything that I found was either old or just didn't really function or work very well, which means that we are actually going to be diving into the base game to explore this, because it is a fascinating history that many people aren't really aware about. First off, yes, we're going to be starting things here in 1936, where it is that after 3 years of being in power, Mustache Man has managed to consolidate things somewhat, but that's not the scenario that we're going to be running with here. Yes, we are forced to start in 1936, but even though the Hearts of Iron 4 focus tree would have us go down the Civil War path that you can see over here, and then from that Civil War, go through potentially another Civil War in order to get to the communist side, we're going to have to skip a lot of things in order to explain how realistically this would work. As I'm sure many people are aware, in the aftermath of World War I, when the German Empire was falling apart, things politically were very unstable, and you saw a lot of fighting in the streets between nationalist and socialist forces over who was going to be taking over the country afterwards. Ultimately, over the course of the Weimar Republic, which ultimately would fail, the nationalists, the fascists, are the ones who would end up taking charge. And one of the reasons that they were able to do this was the fighting in the streets between the communists and fascists were able to be used to showcase that, oh, the communists are dangerous. They're trying to take things over, which yes, they literally were, but the fascists also were, but were able to kind of win that PR campaign of like trying to show that they were the ones who were going to stabilize the country and return Germany to its former glory. Ultimately, obviously it did not, but that was the whole point. That was the marketing campaign that they were launching, if you will. As a result, a lot of people think during this time, oh, well, what if over the course of the late 20s heading into the 30s, like the 1933 campaign, it was the communists that won? That is very unlikely. Like, very, very unlikely. One needs to understand that the Soviet Union and in general communism was seen as a massive threat to all of Europe. And the communists, like the German Communist Party, always was consistently polling anywhere between 10 to 15% over the course of the Weimar Republic. So the idea of it being able to just take over is very unlikely. It could technically happen, but it is very unlikely. Instead, the most likely scenario for the communists to take over Germany instead of the fascists is right after World War I, which we're not really going to be able to showcase here. In 1919, there was a thing called the Spartacus Uprising, where essentially socialist and communist aligned forces tried to rise up in cities all across Germany and take things over, which ultimately did fail. But theoretically, if it had succeeded, or mostly succeeded, we could see socialist or communist elements consolidate their control over the country over the next decade or so. Which, that is kind of the scenario that we're going to be running with here. This is something that actually happened, and to do so, we're going to have to do focus.autocomplete and kind of cheat things along to skip past all the stuff with the Civil War. Hear me out for a sec. Even though it starts in 1936, we're going to need to wait for a little bit. First up, in order to set the scenario, we're going to have to change some of the setting a bit. Like the MIFO bills, that was a whole thing that was done specifically by the fascists. The communists would not have done this. They would have done things a little bit differently. And in fact, what we could argue is that if the communists had taken things over in the first place, that what they would have been able to do is get a kind of reciprocal relationship with the Soviet Union. Over the course of the Great Depression, the Soviet Union was actually in a significantly better position than many of the Western powers because, well, their market was completely closed off. They did not have to worry about the global market. They were autarchical, if you will. I guess maybe that would be the term. They were focused internally, so they didn't have to worry about the market shocks as much. In this new time that we are building, MIFO bills never really comes into existence because the German economy may arguably be weaker in the early 20s, but might be in a slightly stronger position than it was in our own time by the time that 1933 rolls around because of greater trade relations and market isolation with the Soviets. Yeah, don't mind me. We're just gonna have to rally the Wehrmacht and try and skip through all of this quick. None of this matters. Yeah, Mustache Man was never in charge. Yeah, we're gonna need to fast forward a little bit of time here and go through this because unfortunately I can't just skip past things. That's like the limitation that we have of the mod. Not the mod, the base game. Quickly go and occupy everything over here so we don't have to worry about that. And the German Reich is annexed and the Civil War is over. From that, we move to tend to the future of Germany. We're going to assume at this time that it's not 1936, or at least we're going back here at this point and saying, ah, yes, it is 19. We're going to say maybe 25, perhaps, that this happens if there is some kind of like fighting in the streets that takes place between nationalist forces and communist forces. We're going to assume this happens over the course of the early 20s, at a point in which the European powers can't really intervene in necessarily what is going on, and things still proceed in a more democratic manner. Now, with that done, of course, this is where if we were playing an actual game, we could decide, oh, do I want to go down the communist path or do I want to go down the monarch path, which also then verges off into democracy and other stuff. There's a lot of different options for things that you can do here. In our case, no. We will assume that earlier on, the proletariat revolution had already begun. We had hoped that after the First Civil War, that the voice of the workers would have been heard more. It does not, however, seem to be that way. The proletariat deserves better, and by allowing them to rise up, we might finally be able to secure power to those who favor the proletariat once and for all. Yes, this is not happening in 1936. We're going to again assume that this is something that happened back in the 20s. Like, theoretically, what could have happened is that if the whole Spartacus League and that uprising didn't occur in 1919 while the military was still technically active, if this had occurred after the military had mostly been reduced or shut down, like in 1920 or 21 or 22, then we can assume that these communist forces would have actually had significantly more success. So the Proletariat Revolution, we're already going to assume that that happened, that the Red Front Fighters League was resurrected, the National Volksarmy was already reorganized. All of these things would have already happened because this isn't a new thing. It would have already taken place. So yes, I am speed running down this and skipping a lot of things, but that is what would have actually happened. In fact, the normal protocol of what happens here at this time is like, oh, you're supposed to prepare and do all this stuff for like preparing to organize worker rallies and all this other stuff. But no, that is not what we are going to say. Again, it was already successful. So we're just going to go ahead and add political popularity to the Communist Party and just assume that all that is done in the first place. So that means we have the people's victory. The people have spoken and the people have been heard. Our old and corrupt government has shown signs of weakness, and we must seize the opportunity to demand their resignation and take the power for ourselves in the name of the people. Again, we are assuming when talking about this that this does not happen in 1936, even though it is 14th of January 1936. We will say this happened maybe in 1925 or 1926 or maybe even earlier. That is when that happens. Now it is then that we are the Socialist Republic of Germany. Are we done completing focuses yet? No, we absolutely are not. And there's a very key reason why. The reason that we are not done yet here is because, and I know this is going through so many focuses already, one needs to understand that if the Communist Party of Germany had taken over, right, in 1925, the guy who was in charge of the Communist Party that was running for office was basically controlled by the Soviet Union. That is the thing. Like, it is not an exaggeration to say that the Communist Party of Germany was a direct offshoot and then controlled and directed by Moscow. Like, that is the reality. It absolutely was. Meaning, we could run with this idea of like, oh, well, the legacy of the Spartacus League and then going down here for an independent communist like thing. No, it's not. Absolutely, it is going to be a proletarian dictatorship. It is something that is going to be very Stalinist in nature, and that is the reality. The communists are going to be not exactly subservient, we will say, but Germany will be firmly in the communist sphere of the Soviet Union. Absolutely, it would. Even doing this focus right now here for proletarian dictatorship. To provide our people the best possibilities and living standards, we must ensure a stable leadership that is well in tune with the people and their needs. As a longtime fighter for the proletariat, Walter Ulbricht meets all the qualifications and has proven to have nothing but the best in mind for its workers. From this, we will have them gain the trait of being, instead of an inflexible communist, a staunch Stalinist, which is going to increase construction, decrease product efficiency, and it is going to have them be so much more in the way of just like being a full-on Stalinist. From that, as I said, we are going to say that Germany is going to have a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. We are aware of our sizable army, yet we are equally aware that the Soviet Union has an army that we do not wish to engage with. By reaching out and ensuring that we are on the same page to avoid hostilities, we can ensure a better future for all workers in our respective countries. Yes, that is done. A defense treaty with the Soviets is going to be made, naturally. The big thing that I'm talking about here is that industrial cooperation is going to take place. Our cooperation with the Soviets have so far been restricted to military matters. Considering the Soviet Union is an ally of us, it would only make sense for us to cooperate in other fields as well. Our industrial philosophies are already similar enough that joint efforts in the industrial sector should not be difficult to achieve. Yes. From that, there naturally would be technology sharing, there would be resource trade, there would be all of these different things are going to be done. And then, and only then, am I finally then done with the focus autocomplete stuff. Okay, I know that was, holy crap, that is a lot. And to actually do all this is quite literally like 3 or 4 years worth of stuff. Well, I mean, not 3 or 4 years, but like 2, maybe 3 years worth of stuff that we have done in one go. And that is a lot. Yes. The big question then at that point is what is going to be going down with Germany economically as well as militarily. So military-wise, we can say that due to the fact that they're not going to have the rapid buildup of military forces under the nationalists, they're still going to grow, but not nearly at the same rate. So we're going to have a gradual increase in military matters. And from that, MIFO bills was never a thing. Instead, we are faced with a massive economic conundrum. Because technically speaking, right, what would happen is that under a communist system, a 4-year plan makes sense. Autarky makes sense. All of these things are things that would have been done. Absolutely. But we have a massive issue here. Everything that is focused on this side is something that is entirely focused on inherent German aggression. And that is, like, yes, it's perfect for a nationalist fascist playthrough when you're going down the side and then trying to take everything over rapidly. Sure, yes, but that doesn't work, unfortunately, by virtue of the effects to tell the story that I want. So even though a 4-year plan is valid, we have to say that Germany instead, during this time, prioritized economic growth and binding itself to the Soviet Union. Years of negligent fiscal policies have almost ruined our economy. We must build tractors instead of tanks, hand out shovels instead of rifles, and prioritize economic growth instead of growing the arms industry. Yeah, that is what actually would have been done. MIFO bills never would have been a thing, so actually I realize now at this point, I have to turn back on focus.autocomplete, and I have to do that, because that is what would have been happening. Do any of these focuses make sense for the purpose of like an actual communist state, like abolishing price controls and then lowering taxes? No, it does not. But it's what we kind of have to do here, which sucks. The only one that we can truly say in here that we have is workers' rights. The trade union has changed fundamentally in the past few years and are unrecognizable from what they once were. By reforming them, we can rally the workers and reap the benefits. And there, that's all that we will assume. That is it. All right, now we are done. Now we can move on. From here then, over the course of the 30s, we will assume that just like what was happening with the Soviet Union, which was engaging in its own, well, 5-year plan, that after the Soviet Union completes that, and their next one was interrupted by the Germans, that doesn't happen, and instead, the Germans at the same time are rapidly engaging in these same kind of plans and economic deals. Having a strong industry that can compete internationally and pioneer new technologies will be crucial for our continued growth. The Socialist Republic of Germany will be synonymous with quality. Of course, during this time, a massive system of public works is going to be launched, specifically in order to be able to help develop things for the country. At the same time, we can only assume that instead of a civilian economy, that the Germans are also militarized to a degree in the same way that the Soviets are. Not in a, say, absolute warmongering way, but preparing for the global revolution that is to come. As such, even though I could go on war economy right now, it would really only make sense to be on partial mobilization. Like, they're not going to be on a full-on war economy, and they're not going to be, at this time, prepared to take over the world. It wouldn't really make sense. The big important question, then, is that assuming that this has happened, and now there is not one, but 2 major communist powers in the world, how does the rest of the world react? Naturally, of course, neither the UK or France would be happy about this situation at all. There is simply no way that they would. But one also needs to understand that in the event that Germany is flipped communist, there will be additional communist pushes in other parts of Europe, and from that, also probably the world, because it's no longer going to just be the Soviet Union. Instead, there will be more communist agents and elements that will be working different parts of Europe. These agents would be sent into France, they would be sent into Poland, they would be sent into the UK, they would be sent into areas around Germany in order to potentially lay the groundwork for another revolution. So, this is something that would work hand in hand with the forces of, well, Stalin. Ironically, the communists may also do similar things to what the nationalists did, establishing their own, state-owned factories or state-affiliated factories. Volkswagen will still likely be a thing, except, the people, in a sense, will be communist instead of fascist. Where they would likely see significantly more success would be France. And initially, over the course of the 20s and the 30s, despite all the tension between the different aspects, France is most likely where we would see a lot of this cooperation take place between the communist elements there and the Germany and the Soviets. After all, the French were working with the Soviets in the first place, historically in our own timeline, in order to contain the Germans, and they had a very large communist presence inside of the country that very quickly would have destabilized things if things had gone differently than they did in our own time. As it was, the communists were already hamstringing the government and limiting them in the first place in our own time. As such, if they had even more support, it would make sense that over the course of the 30s, the communists would likely take over France as well. From here, then, we have the first big major event that is still likely to take place, the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Italians in this time are still going to be fascist under Mussolini. In fact, he's going to be the only major fascist state, if you will, at this point. And from there, he will try and send as many forces as he can over into the nationalist Spain, specifically in order to be able to boost up support and try and spread ideology and influence. However, he's not going to have nearly the same degree of support that he would in this time, because obviously the Germans have also gone communist, and from there, both Stalinist forces from the Soviet Union as well as Germany are going to be sending volunteers down into Spain. They will, of course, be supporting the Republican side, but this is where things are going to get kind of interesting. See, the Stalinists from the Soviet Union also heavily destabilized the Republicans, but in the event that we have even more volunteers of more communist elements that are able to come over to the Republican side, this means that not only will the Republicans get more support, more arms, more everything, but also their government policy is likely to be significantly more influenced at this point. Yes, it is our duty to help our comrades in Spain whatever way we can against the forces of fascism. Sending battle-hardened troops will surely be appreciated. Yes, this is going to happen, though in this case, the troops are going to be less battle-hardened, and this will be some of the primary experience that the Germans are going to gain in this new time. Considering the sheer amount of forces that would be coming over at this time, it is very likely that the Republicans are going to perform significantly better. Along with this, in regards to how it is that the Germans are going to develop their military, it would make sense that they would still pursue maneuver warfare. It doesn't really make sense that they would go, oh yeah, we're just going to go back to artillery and the basic old stuff. Tanks were still a big thing, and there were enough German inventors and developers at this time that they really would likely adopt New Panzer Doctrine, especially as this would be closely tied with Soviet efforts to produce their own tanks, and this cooperation would actually be very beneficial. Of course, things in Spain were still going to be absolutely chaotic, and the Defense Council was still going to rise up. In general, things were still going to be a massive mess, of course. But theoretically, with greater communist subversion and more things that could be taking place, the nationalists themselves may also struggle to gain any ground, which will lead to their own internal divisions, which in turn may lead to their own uprisings and things falling apart. The war, in general, is likely to be much more chaotic in this new time. Still, it does not mean that everything in the world is going to be different. Japan is still going to be doing what it does best, which is creating chaos over there in Asia. The Marco Polo Bridge incident is still going to take place. All these things are still going to happen, but there will be no united fascist bloc. As time goes on, varying different aspects of the German economy are continuing to be nationalized. Having seen the positive outcome of our state centralization of the economy, we might be considering the same for our industry. As it is now, the industry is split under many private owners, using different processes and methods of manufacturing their goods. Nationalizing the industries will give us much more control over the output and efficiency of production. Potentially, by the mid of 1938, the situation in Spain may actually be somewhat stabilized with a kind of static front. The Republicans were able to hold on to the capital, they did not let Madrid fall, and from that, the nationalists have been pushed back into a corner. Yes, the Republicans are still divided, but things are far more equal than they were in our own time. The fascinating thing is that if you go and actually look down the sides here, we have different options of like liberating Austria, liberating Italy, sparking the flame of revolution. But like, you could do all these things, which is a really cool thing for the actual game. And I'm going to need to do a proper playthrough of this, that's not so cheesy. But simultaneously, it's not realistic to assume that the communist states are going to be declaring war. Stalin himself, yes, he did want to enlarge the spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. However, the goal was to maintain the 5-year plan, to build internally before being able to spread communism outwards. Even with the rise of Germany, they will be utilizing spies to spread communist influence. They're not going to be just declaring war and trying to take everything over. That doesn't really make much sense. Everything is going to be focused much more internally. The funny thing is, because of this rapid industrialization that would likely take place this time through cooperation with the Soviet Union, this is something that would make the Western forces nervous, and yet at the same time, there wouldn't be nearly as much of a rapid military buildup. There would be a kind of proto-Cold War, if you will, during this point. And with communist forces well on their way to securing a victory in France come the next election, there really is no reason for the communists to do more to try and necessarily stage an uprising. This is a thing that you need to understand. Even Stalin, in the aftermath of World War II, he didn't try to take over Italy because he believed that the Italian Communist Party was going to win the election that followed. They didn't, but this is the reason why he didn't do that. Also, if it seems like I'm skipping the description of a number of these different things here that are being passed, yeah, that's the reality, is that none of these are necessarily as relevant to the story. Like, yeah, Germany during this time will be expanding social welfare, women's rights and equality, all this stuff is going to be pursued. There will be varying different aspects of communist ideology that is going to be pushed outwards. Yeah, that is all going to happen. The big thing, though, is specifically the influence that is going to try to be grown in the places around. Because eventually, the Republicans are going to win the Civil War down in Spain in this new time. That's going to happen with drastic increased German and Soviet help. At the same time, communist influence is going to be grown, and from this, we will likely see a communist takeover of Spain. After the communist takeover of Spain, we will see the communist takeover of France, and from that, we will have an entire communist bloc spread out across the entirety of Europe. Lithuania declared war on Poland. Oh dear God, what is happening over here? Hold on. Why? For what? We can only assume that through greater communist influence that is, well, all over Europe at this point, it likely leads to destabilizing efforts between nationalist forces and others and results in a conflict, maybe a border conflict? Oh dear God, I don't know why this is happening. The fascinating thing to note here is that the Italians are arguably going to be in a significantly better position in this new time. I say that, it's not overall, but they're not playing second fiddle to Germany. Mussolini is going to have a stronger presence. The fascists within Austria are going to align themselves with the Italians much more closely. The Yugoslavians, the Serbs, the varying different entities, seeing the rise of a communist threat, may bind themselves closer to Italy. The Balkans in general will likely unite behind the fascist forces of Italy as a bulwark against communism, which will be seen as a much greater threat. This in turn means that Italy is likely to also have significantly better relations with the UK in this time, which will be watching with great trepidation what is going on the continent. Even now, battles of influence would be taking place across Europe as democratic aligned forces, communist aligned forces, fascist aligned forces, all of these different entities would be trying to build up their own blocks. And from this, as more communist nations arise, it would make sense that with the two largest, most powerful communist entities on the continent, that the Soviet Union and the Germans would engage in diplomacy in order to determine their spheres of influence. With two similar-minded countries in such close proximity, we must set a level playing field for us and the Soviets. By establishing a sphere of influence and designating one for our comrades to the east, we limit the risk of armed conflict. Essentially, it's kind of like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, except much more ideologically compatible. Italy declare war upon... Hold up. Would Italy declare war upon the United Kingdom in this time? What is this war over? Attacker war goals to take the islands of the Mediterranean. In an effort to drive out democratic and communist forces, it makes sense that the Italians, possibly without the aid of France this time, as the communists would have been limiting the UK's sphere, the UK would be completely isolated as the Italians and their new bloc tried to establish control over Mediterranean bases. That is an interesting development, to say the least. This, though, in the event of an actual war breaking out at this time, would be the exact thing that the communists would desire, because it would allow them to destabilize the world further and increase the chances of a communist revolution. Conflict is something that actually brings this about. Obviously, the Italian Navy is not something that is going to really be able to compare to the UK Navy, except in this time, they're not going to have France to deal with, as France is not going to be associated with this conflict at all. They're not going to support the UK, they're not going to support anything, they will maintain isolation as they will be politically divided, far too politically divided to do anything. With the UK then distracted, this means that the Soviet Union would begin to be able to exert influence on those around it. The Winter War is still likely something that will break out here in the case of Finland, and the Germans may then see this as an opportunity to be able to launch their own efforts around, well, their neighbors. Not quite yet, though. Poland, of course, during this time was fiercely anti-communist. In fact, to the point that they were willing to really work with the Germans at different points to combat the Soviets, but not necessarily fully. So the Polish are going to then join, not with the Italians here, but with the UK, seeing it as their only real viable lifeline surrounded by communist entities around them. And here, Greece, instead of being hostile to Italy, now joins the Italian League. The Italian influence over the Mediterranean grows, and from here, a true rival to the UK there exists. 1940 then, that is going to be the big thing. The big one that changes everything. Communists are likely to win the election in France. At the same time, the 1940 election with the communists in Spain, they're likely to win there as well. From here, an entire communist bloc is built across Europe, and the Italians, seeing which way things are maybe turning with the French, may decide to preemptively intervene, which in turn will lead to a wider conflict. Though the French may be inclined to join with the Allies as they would already be at war in this new time, instead what is likely to end up happening here is that with the new communist blocs being built up all across Europe, Spain, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, all would combine forces to absolutely, utterly crush Italy. As communist forces begin to arrive en masse, the fighting turns bloody and brutal over the course of the Alps. German forces begin to flood into Austria, trying to break through. At the same time, the French, through distracted forces from the Italians, are able to break through the Alps on their side and push through into the south. Through these efforts, it is very likely that Austria would fall. Yes, it's probably something that, considering the German lack of focus on militarization in this new timeline, is going to be less effective than they were in our own, but simultaneously, there are going to be way more numbers, a way more stable economy, a way more everything pretty much, that in turn is going to allow the French as well as the Spanish to be able to move through into the Italian heartlands and completely cut off their forces. Eventually, considering this conflict and the way it would play out, by winter, maybe spring of 1941, Rome falls. As the Soviet Union blitzkriegs into the Balkans, gradually cutting off Italy's allies, it is then surrounded on all sides and crushed. As Italy collapses into civil war, you're going to see the rise of varying different communist elements that were previously suppressed by the fascists that are going to end up rising up and trying to join with the communist bloc. Until eventually, everything collapses. And this is where things get very interesting, because here, of course, we're going to have the varying different degrees of influence that are going to be established. The Soviet Union and the Germans are going to end up dividing the territory between them as to who is going to own what. The spheres of influence that were previously established is exactly what we are going to see here, with much of the Balkans specifically being occupied by the Soviets. Influence in Italy is likely to be split between the two, but really with that would be the end of conflict in Europe as we know it. From here, the communists would actually dominate the entirety of the continent. Gradually, varying different forces would begin to move into other territories. Yes, perhaps the global revolution would take this place at this time or within the next couple of years, as the Soviet and German forces would then be fully mechanized and able to then dominate the entire world. However, that all being said, there's no guarantee that these forces are going to work together. There is quite literally a possibility that some kind of major communist split could happen that will end up with war between the Germans and the Soviets at some point, or some kind of massive three-way Cold War. We don't really know. But in the event that the communists are able to take over Germany and from there work with the Soviets, the kind of power that this would create, the sheer level of imbalance is so massive that the world itself at this point would be under threat. The United States, the UK, would probably have to sign a permanent peace deal. And from there, the US would lose access to much of its foreign markets unless it can work out a deal with the communists. That being said, considering the sheer level of anti-communist sentiment within the US during this time, that is unlikely to happen, which means that the US economy is never going to get supercharged. Instead, they will likely be forced to work with the Japanese in order to build an anti-communist bloc. What that looks like going into the 40s and 50s, well, we are likely going to see a much deadlier war. But with that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today because by this point, I don't really know what else I could really do to play things out here. And it's, oh dear God, that is a lot. Let me know in the comment section what it is that you all think, what kind of scenario we should create next. And yeah, with that, we're going to end things here today. Goodbye, my friends. I will see you all here next time. Best of luck to you.